G'day and welcome back to the second part of this large ship design tutorial. We've built most of the internals and now we're going to add a few final touches. And then we'll clad the whole thing in an armour shell. Controlling air vents from within the control panel is a bit of a pain, so something that might be useful within our airlock is to have a button panel set up. We can then use it to open and close the doors, to depressurise and pressurise the area, which, if we're starting to run low on ice, might be useful so that we're not ending up discharging lots of oxygen out into space. The size of this cockpit area has actually ended up quite a lot larger than I'd anticipated, which is a good thing, because we may want to later add an oxygen tank, and there might be some other things that we can think of to add later as well. One thing that might be useful at this stage, since I disconnected the ship from the base power supply, is to add a little bit of uranium to the ship so that systems are online, and once we get some ice on board we can start filling up those massive hydrogen tanks. Alright, so now it's time for us to get the large thruster on the back. I wanted to use a single large thruster, not multiple smaller ones or a double, because the single large thruster, it'll highlight the fact that this ship has double at the front, single at the back, again further distracting us from any possibility of it being a brick. I want to get the large thruster in the dead center, but if we try to put it onto the back of the refinery directly, it's not going to connect. To be able to build the large thruster onto the back, we're going to have to add a few light armor blocks so that we can actually place it where we want it. With the thruster where we want it, we've now got to think of how to connect it to the conveyor system. Fortunately, the large thruster has multiple ports on which you can connect. It's got 4 around the outside and 1 in the center on the reverse aspect from the thrust direction. That was a mouthful. We're going to use the top one and we're going to connect it to the port on the refinery. If you were designing this ship for combat, this setup would be a little less than optimal. We've got a large thruster that's our only thruster in that direction, connected via a couple of light armor blocks and a conveyor system. With a bit of bad luck, all of those connections could be severed at once. So if you're planning for combat, you've got to think about these things as well during your design phase. This ship is exploration only. We'll be avoiding conflict by getting away fast, so we don't need to worry about that here. Now it's time for the real fun part. Putting some armor on this thing so that we can give it a bit of style. My preferred approach to these sorts of things is to try and make it look like the armor is actually providing some element of support or other structure that's meaningful, and this helps me to create lines and connections throughout the ship that make visual sense. An example of this sort of idea might be the ribs that you see on a lot of the ships on the workshop, and I even use these on a lot of my designs myself. I find that they add interest to otherwise large, flat areas. To start off on this one, we'll build a row of blocks all the way down the side of the hydrogen tanks. I'm going to try and leave some of the hydrogen tank exposed. The extra detail of the designs on blocks like this can be useful to leave exposed because it adds further interest and depth. We can use part of the 2x1x1 slopes to create a mirroring of the thruster cone in the armor itself. These blocks are incredibly useful to add a little bit of variety where it otherwise can be a bit difficult to. Like I've said before, don't worry too much about getting it perfect on your first run. That's why we build in these scaffolds, and it's fairly easy with light armor to grind it down and replace it as you need to, or as the design suits. In the previous video I mentioned that I was adding the conveyor extensions after the oxygen generators so that we could taper a little towards the back. So let's do that with the armor as well. We'll use the 2x1x1 ramps for a couple of layers so that we get a slight movement in, and then at the very end we'll use the sharp 45 degrees to bring it into the thruster at the rear. When you're placing a lot of armor blocks, the auto rotate tool can sometimes actually be a hindrance. I like to turn it off, and to do this you press T. Sometimes I forget that it's on and forget that it's off, but it's useful to remember that it's there when you're getting frustrated at something rotating when you don't expect it to. One thing I've noticed is that it doesn't seem to turn off unless you're holding a rotatable block at the time you press the T key. If I'm having trouble visualizing what my design's going to look like at the end, I will sometimes build the mirrored side straight after building the first side. But if I've got a good idea, it can help to build more of it so that you're not having to change both sides when you change one side. And whoops. So, it can be useful to make sure that when you grind down a block, something else is holding the other blocks it's connected to in place, so that your thruster and connection apparatus don't fall off. So we'll have to rebuild those. But they were in the way of our armor, so we'll have to figure out another way to connect it onto the conveyor system. This is just one of many revisions that I usually end up making, but this time we're going to connect it onto the conveyor system that supports the forward thruster, and we'll just snake our way through down to our position that we were in before. There's probably a reasonable chance that we'll have to remodel this again, but I like to have it in place so that when I'm putting my armor on, I don't forget about it altogether. That has happened to me before, and man, is it annoying. We'll grind down the old one and weld up the new one, and it'll be like nothing ever happened. See, nothing happened. With that little mistake fixed up, let's continue with matching the other side's armor that we've placed down already. We'll go all the way around the hydrogen tanks, and once we're done, we'll look at what we can do to enhance this further and to continue on with the design. We'll speed up this part because it's all identical to what we'd done before. The point to note though is it can be really handy to keep checking back on the other side to make sure that you're not misjudging or miscounting, as I actually do in the middle of this section. I did too many of one diagonal and I needed to switch over to the other slope type. So now that we're almost done with that, we can move on to what we might do around these front thrusters. I don't like them sitting out like little pimples on the armor, so we'll put a few little tips of the 2x1x1 slopes on either side, and probably above and below once we get to that as well. The armor on the landing gear should really connect up to the other armor sets, so we'll bring it forward with an extra cube and then we'll put a few slopes in place to smooth the transition round to the front, and the anti-pimple piece as well. We'll make sure they're matched on both sides, and then we'll move on to the next section, which is following from the landing gear back towards the main part of the ship. Once I've come up with an idea of how to arrange armor around a particular block, like thrusters or something like that, I tend to reuse that idea with a few different variations on my designs. This helps you build something more quickly that still looks decent, and you can always finesse those things and make them more unique to a particular ship later on. This can also be a useful design approach if you're trying to create a fleet of ships that look like they came from the same design house or same faction, because all of the ships will have similar design elements shared, but each have their own unique twist on those designs. So with these thrusters on the underside of the hydrogen tanks, I'm not going to use the 2x1x1 slopes the same way as I did on the side, also because I think it'll look a bit silly having two of them snuggled up next to each other, and instead we're going to come up with a different way of approaching it, still using the 2x1x1 slopes, but in a slightly different fashion. Taking a step back and having a look at the armor that we've put on so far, it doesn't really look like it's supported in any way. So I think it might help if we add some armor in a circumferential way around the hydrogen tanks. This will at least visually appear better supported than it currently does. With that 2x1x1 tip attached to the lower section of the armor, I'm not 100% convinced that it looks alright, so I'll check it out from a few angles. And actually, I think it'll look okay. We'll see if we're still happy with it once we've done the full welding on the ship. During the next part of the build, I'm going to speed up the playback. The reason I'm going to do this is it took me about 5 minutes or more to actually complete the structural support around the hydrogen tanks. It's all following the same principles we've discussed so far, and running it at a slightly higher speed will pretty much only get rid of the bits where I'm sitting there thinking and going, what will work next? Most of these are the same as what I've done so far. There aren't any new ideas in this section. When we move on to building the cockpit, then we'll have to approach it with some different ideas, because we've got some large flat areas to deal with, as well as trying to continue the look of a structurally sound armor plating. When I'm actually approaching building armor onto ships like this, or onto stations, or wherever I'm doing it, I tend to build the parts that I've got a strong artistic visual concept for. So I liked the idea of having these hydrogen tanks extending out from the front of the ship. So I thought I'd do that first, and I'd attach the armour to those first, because that was an area I knew what I wanted to achieve. And then I might do the part around the cockpit, because that was what I also had a strong idea about. Building like that does create one problem though. When you've got to join these areas up, you might sit there scratching your head going, how do I do this? How's this going to work? And sometimes it's best just to shove some stuff on there and see what works. That's kind of how I normally do it. I'm reasonably happy with the shape so far, so I think it's time to move on to the cockpit. We have that recessed area around where the control station sits, and I want to highlight that a little bit more. So if we slope the next layer of blocks away from where the current layer are, it will make that even more obvious. But we can also make it a little bit streamlined by using some of the corner and inverted corner blocks. We'll place those around this window so that it sits back neatly in this pocket. One of the downsides of what we've just done is that from the inside, we're going to end up with a nice square edge right above the control station. So at some point we may need to figure out how to hide that better so that it still looks alright from the inside as well. It is one of the things you need to keep in mind when you're designing your armour, is what it's going to look like from both sides. This may be relevant especially when you're colouring, as the colouring might start looking a bit funky on the inside if you've got everything looking right on the outside. If you've got the room to make double layers of armour when you've got those problems, then that can be a good solution, albeit heavy. So this is one of those transition zones that I'm talking about. I've placed down these 2x1x1 slopes, and I think at the moment they're working, but as the design goes on, we'll see how well that holds up. We can continue the ridge theme that we've got going on the hydrogen tanks into the transition zone between the hydrogen tank part of the ship and the cockpit part of the ship by making a wall there and using the slopes in the direction of the hydrogen part. Then once we start adding the slopes back from there, we can see how we might transition between the two. Taking a broader look at the hydrogen tanks, we can see we have a strong line running down the vertical ridge line of it. That's a line I'd like to try to continue in some way into the cockpit area, either having it taper off to the outside or even bending it through, taking it all the way back into the hydrogen thruster at the rear. I like to have these lines crossing over zones of the ship, because when you do that, you tend to create this sense of a wholeness, a oneness of the design, which if you pull it off, and I often don't, but there are some amazing designers out there that do, you end up with a ship that looks complete. It looks like everything is meant to be there, that there's nothing that needs to be added or taken away or anything. A great example of this, if you want to look on the workshop, is the Leviathan. It's what I'd consider to be a truly beautiful ship, and I've even used it in our Machinima series Light Echoes as a crashed ship because it just looked so cool. With that little extension of the ridgeline down, it still looks like there's something missing, and I think it's the circumferential ridging. So I'm not a huge fan of how it looks with the 45 degrees, so let's put one of these 2x1x1 tips in there, and hopefully that'll be enough to keep all of the design continuous. And we'll pop one on the other side as well. I suppose one way to look at the way I design things is a bit freeform. I tend to jump around between things that pique my interest at any particular time. Like now I'll skip off to building the sidewall bit at the rear. I'll double that up, and if I don't like that bit, or if I'm happy with that and then I see another bit that I think I can add to, I'll jump over there. This can make it quite difficult to structure this tutorial series, but as I said, this is how I build. Some of you had asked how I built the base design in the previous videos, and this is how I did it. I went through bit by bit, built a bit, changed a bit, didn't like a bit, added it, fixed it, changed it, etc, etc. And in the end I come up with a design that I'm usually reasonably happy with. If you're building something larger, you probably want to have a general design concept in mind before you even start. Maybe even some concept pictures. You could have downloaded them from Google Image Search, you could have drawn them yourself, whatever. If you have that, the design will hold together better when you're extending it over a large area. I struggled with this when I was building the RX394 for the Machinima series. This thing is about 400 meters long, and to create sections of it that looked like they were part of the same ship but still looked unique was really challenging with the way I designed things. And if I did it again, I would definitely have an overall design before I started. Now, during all that jibber jabber, I've been staring at the back of this ship, and it's just not quite what I wanted it to be. There's something about the way that those conveyor tubes are sitting that I just don't think is going to look right with the armour. So, unlike last time, I'm not going to make it so that this whole bit drops off. I'll use a couple of bits of scaffolding down the bottom to connect the thruster to the rest of the ship, so then I can grind away the conveyors at the top. Once I've replaced those with conveyor junctions, I'll be able to use the conveyors to connect to both sides of the hydrogen thruster at the rear, getting rid of the bit at the top and having it look more symmetrical because the pipes can come down on both sides in the same way, all nice and neat. Conveniently, as a side effect, this does help that defense problem I talked about earlier, as this at least gives the thruster one more connection point than it had before. So now we can grind off that conveyor up the top of the thruster and have a bit of a glance at how everything's looking. I'm not super happy with how all these conveyors look. I think we'll remove a couple here and then try and figure out whether there's another spot that might be more suitable to connect to. I think if we take out the piece of conveyor that's between the oxygen generator and the assembler and replace it with a conveyor junction, we might be able to hide this tubing in amongst the interior armour and the exterior armour. That might work better and allow us to hide a little bit of this messy design within our cladding or our internal design. Since we're already going to have armour above and around the assembler, hiding conveyor tubing running directly over the top of it works as a nice solution. When you're designing your conveyor systems, sometimes it works better for your overall design if you don't use the shortest route possible to get to a point. Sometimes something circuitous can actually look much neater from the outside, even if once you look at that piping, it's absolutely bananas. Of course, if you are building this in survival, maybe looks aren't your first priority because maybe you're struggling for a particular resource, so making all of the motors necessary for your conveyor system might not be such an easy task. And if that's the case, build to what you can first, upgrade it when you have the resources. Since I'm now mostly happy with the conveyor system, I can get rid of that scaffolding that we had around the thruster. And now it's time to build the cockpit roof. Well, at least some of it. I want the cockpit to be 2 blocks high on the inside. This allows me to do a bit of extra design work on the interior, as well as making it feel a little bit less claustrophobic. I'm not a huge fan of the 2.5 meter ceiling. It feels a bit tight, so we'll make it a bit taller since we probably end up having the space, and I think that roof level will actually line up more nicely with the cladding that's going along the hydrogen thrusters. To lay down a basic concept of what we're going to have as our roof for the cockpit area, we can go around the walls and match slopes and corner pieces to the established walls that are already there. Thinking about what's underneath them, whether we'll need some lighting in the area, which can often benefit from having a 2 block high area underneath the ceiling. But even if we don't get any of that stuff right, just following the shapes will help us get a greater idea, particularly once we've welded it all up and we're actually in the area, you can get a good feel for the space. I really like using the slopes and corner pieces in areas like this because it feels more deliberate to me than having a random cube just jutting out of somewhere. Even if you know that you've put that cube there because it provides you air tightness against the reactor or the conveyor or the gyroscope or whatever that's actually behind that spot. When you're walking through that space, all you see is this big cube stuck out of nowhere. If you use slopes and you try and blend that in with the other walls, you'll just see a wall that seemed planned. It seemed deliberate. And if you're building a spaceship, you're probably going to be deliberate about it. Even if it is as easy as it is in the world of space engineers, you'll still be deliberate. These are resources. So I like to make my designs feel that way. Either deliberate utilitarian, so pipes going everywhere like a giant refinery setup, or really sleek with walls covering anything that's mechanical at all, and all you can see are the necessary control components. I like these things to look planned. Now we're at another point where I'm welding again. This is because I was starting to lose track of where I was at. I wasn't feeling like I had a good grasp of exactly where the blocks were placed, and I thought now would be a good time so that I can finalize that roof with clear idea of what's there. In the next video, you'll see me finish off that roof, touch up a few extra bits of the shape and design of the interior of the ship, as well as a couple of exterior bits that I wasn't quite happy with. And then in the final video, we'll do coloring, and then we'll take this bird for a test flight, all the way up into space, and see how well she flies. See you then!